You know that physical jolt you get when a fire alarm goes off in the middle of the night?
Oh, yeah. Total immediate panic.
Right, exactly. Your heart rate spikes instantly, your breathing gets incredibly shallow, and your brain just, immediately jumps to the absolute worst case scenario.
It is pure biological panic, fight or flight.
It really is. And, well, that is exactly the feeling we are exploring today in this deep dive. But, not about a literal fire. Today, we're tackling a topic that triggers that exact same physiological panic response for parents or educators or really anyone who cares for an adolescent.
Right. We're talking about non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI.
Yes. And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right from the start. We know this is a heavy topic. Discovering that a teenager you love is intentionally harming themselves might be, one of the hardest things a family can ever encounter.
Absolutely. It shakes you to your core.
But our mission today is to help you move past that initial paralyzing wave of fear. We are going to unpack the complex, highly specific mechanics of exactly why this happens. And then we're going to look at a really fascinating systemic solution currently rolling out in Georgia called MentalSpace School.
Which is doing some incredible work.
Yeah, they're bringing an entirely new model of same-day teletherapy right into K-12 schools, basically to catch these kids before they fall through the cracks.
It is incredibly important that we establish a baseline of calm right out of the gate here. When you're confronted with NSSI, whether you are a parent finding a hidden razor or, say, an educator noticing something off in a classroom.
Right. The natural reaction is just extreme distress.
Exactly. The human reaction is extreme distress. And sometimes that even manifests as reactive anger or a desire to immediately, control the situation. But the clinical reality tells us that approaching this with grounded insight rather than panic is the absolute crucial first step.
Because if you panic, they panic.
Exactly. We have to understand the specific mechanics of the behavior before we can ever hope to actually change it.
Okay, so let's deconstruct what NSSI actually is, because the immediate fear, the absolute terror a parent feels when they see a cut or a burn is that they are looking at a suicide attempt.
And that is the most critical misconception, and we really need to clear it up immediately. The clinical definition explicitly separates the two.
So they're fundamentally different things.
Yes, NSSI is a maladaptive coping strategy for overwhelming, unbearable emotion. It is not an attempt to end one's life. Now, to be absolutely clear, engaging in NSSI does statistically elevate a person's future suicide risk.
Which makes sense. It's a serious red flag.
Exactly. And because of that, it always, without exception, warrants an immediate professional assessment by a licensed clinician. But the act of self-injury itself is fundamentally about managing pain, not ending life.
I was actually trying to conceptualize how physical pain could possibly manage emotional pain, and I keep coming back to a mechanical analogy.
Oh, I like analogies. Let's hear it.
Well, think of a high-pressure boiler system. When the steam builds up to critical levels, there has to be a release valve, right? Otherwise, the entire system explodes.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the emotional state of these adolescents.
Well, it seems like NSSI is essentially a faulty, incredibly dangerous release valve on that emotional boiler.
Yep.
The teenager is experiencing this terrifying, crushing pressure of emotional distress.
Which could be anything, really. Maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's trauma.
Right, or extreme social rejection. And they don't have a safe, functional valve installed yet to let that steam out naturally, so they use this dangerous one.
And it does briefly let the steam out.
Yeah, it actually relieves that immediate, paralyzing emotional pressure, but it actively damages the system in the process.
And if you look at the neurobiology of what is happening in the moment, your boiler analogy holds up perfectly. Because when a teenager engages in self-injury, their body actually releases endorphins.
Wait, really? Endorphins?
Yeah. It's a biological response to physical pain, but it provides a temporary rushing sense of calm. It physically forces the brain to focus entirely on the acute physical sensation, momentarily drowning out the psychological agony.
Wow. So it actually works in the short term.
It is highly effective in the short term, which is exactly why it becomes so addictive.
That explains so much about the typical parental reaction and honestly why it usually backfires. If I'm a parent and I discover this dangerous release valve, my immediate instinct from a place of intense protective love, of course, is to just take the valve away.
Right, you want to shut it down immediately.
Totally. I'm going to issue ultimatums. I'm going to ground them. I'm, taking the bedroom door off the hinges, and I am going through the house to remove every single sharp object I can find.
Which is completely understandable. You just want to remove the danger. But here is the psychological reality of why that fails. Punishment and confiscation do not give the teenager a new functional valve.
It just leaves them with all the pressure.
Exactly. It traps the emotional pain inside the boiler. NSSI exists precisely because the adolescent has not yet developed effective internal ways to manage intense emotional distress.
So if you just take away their only coping mechanism,
Even if it's maladaptive, if you take it without actively providing a replacement, the pressure just builds and builds until they find another dangerous way to release it or the system truly fails.
so we really have to look at this as a symptom of a missing tool rather than just quote-unquote bad behavior.
Precisely. It's a skill deficit.
Which brings us to a really difficult reality for anyone raising a teenager. How do you even know the pressure is building if they are actively hiding the valve? I mean, secrecy seems to be the whole point.
Secrecy is absolutely a hallmark of NSSI. But there are three major warning signs that every parent and educator should be trained to look for.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the most direct, but honestly often overlooked. It's unexplained cuts, burns, scratches, or bruises, particularly if the adolescent frequently claims they're just clumsy or they always blame the family pet.
But kids are smart. They know how to hide those, right?
They do, which leads to the second, much more visible sign. Persistently wearing long sleeves and long pants in warm weather.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Yeah. If it's a humid 90-degree day in Georgia and a student is stubbornly wearing a heavy hoodie and refuses to take it off even during physical activity, that is a significant red flag.
Because they're covering it up.
Right. Adolescents frequently self-injure on their forearms, thighs, or stomach areas, easily covered by clothing.
So the hoodie essentially becomes a shield.
Exactly. And the third sign is highly secretive behavior, particularly spending long, unexplained periods of time locked in the bathroom or their bedroom.
But isn't that just like normal teenage stuff, wanting privacy?
It is, but it's more than just the typical teenage need for privacy. It's isolation, coupled with a noticeable emotional shift when they emerge.
Okay, let's play this out. Let's say a parent spots the hoodie in July. They notice the bathroom isolation. They realize their child is really struggling with this. I think a lot of people listening might wonder, if the root problem is just intense emotional pressure, why can't a deeply loving, attentive parent just sit down and talk it out with them?
It's a fair question.
Right. Like, why do we specifically need a specialized clinical intervention? What is it about dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, that makes it the absolute gold standard here?
That is a fundamental question. The answer is that when emotional dysregulation reaches the neurological point of self-injury, standard conversation is no longer sufficient.
It's past the point of just chatting.
Exactly. You simply can't talk someone out of a biological coping mechanism. Let's clarify something real quick. People often hear about cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Great. Yeah, CBT is super common.
It is, and CBT is incredibly effective for many things. It focuses on identifying negative thought patterns and changing how you think to change how you feel.
Right, like recognizing a cognitive distortion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But DBT is fundamentally different. It was specifically designed for people who experience extreme emotional instability. It assumes that you can't always just change the thought.
Because sometimes the thought is just too strong.
Because sometimes the pain is there, it is real, and it is overwhelming. DBT isn't just talking about feelings. It is active, rigorous, mechanical skill building. Remember the missing valve?
Yeah, the boiler analogy.
DBT is the literal process of building and installing a new one.
Okay, I need a concrete example of that because skill building can sound a bit like, clinical jargon. What does that actually look like for a teenager in a panic state?
Let's look at the four specific pillars of DBT. The first is emotion regulation, teaching the adolescent how to identify, label, and physically modulate the emotions they are feeling.
Okay, makes sense. What's the second?
The second pillar is where the real mechanics come in, distress tolerance.
Teaching them to tolerate the pressure.
Yes. It's about surviving an emotional crisis without making it worse. It's teaching them that they can actually sit with severe emotional pain and it will eventually pass without them needing to self-injure.
But how do they do that when their brain is literally screaming at them to find relief?
They use specific practiced physical techniques. For example, therapists teach a set of distress tolerance skills known by the acronym TIPP. The T stands for temperature.
Temperature, like changing the room temperature.
More drastic than that. If a teen is in a state of high emotional crisis, their heart is racing, their amygdala is firing, they're in full fight or flight. A DBT therapist will teach them to literally dunk their face in a bowl of ice water.
Wait, really? Ice water?
Yes, or hold an ice pack to their eyes and cheeks for 30 seconds.
What does that actually do? It sounds intense.
It is, but it triggers something called the mammalian dive reflex. It is a biological imperative. When cold water hits the nerve receptors on your face, your brain thinks you are diving underwater.
Oh,
And it immediately physically forces your heart rate to slow down to conserve oxygen. It instantly dials down the physiological arousal of the panic attack.
that is fascinating. It's basically a biological hack. You aren't asking them to think happy thoughts. You are giving them a physical replacement for the physical release of self-injury.
Precisely. You are giving them a safe valve.
Hmm.
And the other pillars of DBT include interpersonal effectiveness, helping them communicate their boundaries and needs to others, and mindfulness.
Right, mindfulness is huge.
It is. It trains the brain to stay anchored in the present moment rather than spiraling into catastrophic anxiety about the future. When you combine DBT with family therapy to help the parents understand these new systems, you have a really comprehensive evidence-based treatment plan.
And that completely explains why you absolutely need a licensed clinician to guide a family through this. I mean, a parent doesn't instinctively know how to leverage the mammalian dive reflex to stop a panic attack.
Most definitely not.
So we know the mechanics, we know the gold standard of treatment, but this exposes a massive systemic bottleneck. How on earth do we get vulnerable teenagers access to these licensed clinicians fast enough?
That is the core crisis we are facing, particularly in schools. School counselors and crisis teams are almost always the first to spot the long sleeves or the bathroom isolation.
But they can't treat it themselves.
Right. While schools can identify the problem, they haven't historically had the infrastructure to actually treat it.
Yeah, I'm picturing the reality of this. A school nurse identifies a kid in need, they call the parents in the middle of a workday, and then what? The parent is handed a list of local therapists, they call around, and they get put on a waiting list for 6 months.
Which happens all the time.
If your boiler is about to explode today, a repair appointment in December doesn't help you at all.
Exactly. And the data shows NSSI rates among adolescents have been steadily rising. The landscape of access has to change to meet the urgency of the moment. And that is exactly what we are seeing happen in Georgia right now through a specialized model called MentalSpace School.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of this because it's a fascinating shift in how we handle public health. They are providing K-12 mental health support directly inside Georgia schools, primarily through same-day teletherapy.
Yes.
And that phrase, same day, is what really stops me in my tracks.
It completely changes the timeline of care. MentalSpace School essentially partners with school districts to act as an integrated clinical arm. They provide dedicated teams of licensed therapists for each school, focusing on crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, and ongoing therapy.
Walk me through a real-world scenario. Let's say it's a Tuesday afternoon. A teacher notices blood on a student's sleeve. The student goes to the nurse's office. Instead of just calling the parents to come pick up their child and start dialing phone numbers, what actually happens?
Well, under this model, the school can immediately initiate a same-day teletherapy intake. The nurse logs into a secure portal, and with parental consent, that student is sitting in a private room talking to a licensed, culturally competent clinician on a screen within hours, if not minutes.
That is like dropping a fully functioning mental health ER right into a middle school.
It is triage at the exact moment of crisis. The system has built-in clinical risk assessments. The therapist can immediately determine, is this student engaging in non-suicidal self-injury to cope, or have they crossed the line and meet the criteria for active suicidality?
Wow.
That professional assessment happens immediately, not 6 months down the line.
I want to address some of the administrative realities here because whenever you mix healthcare and the public school system, it sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare. I see a lot of terms thrown around regarding this program: HAPA compliance, FERPA compliance, and helping districts meet House Bill 268 deadlines.
It's a lot of acronyms.
Yeah, let's translate that into plain English for a parent or a teacher listening. Does FERPA compliance just mean that a child's deeply personal therapy notes don't end up attached to their math grade and academic record?
That is exactly what it means. It's creating a watertight privacy wall. IPA protects the medical data, ensuring the therapy sessions remain strictly confidential between the clinicians, the student, and the family.
And FERPA?
FOPA ensures the school doesn't have inappropriate access to those clinical records. The school facilitates the connection, but they do not sit in on the therapy.
Got it. And what about HB 268?
House Bill 268 is a major piece of legislation in Georgia that mandates public schools implement comprehensive safety and mental health response plans by July 2026.
So schools have to do this anyway.
Right, and a lot of districts are scrambling to figure out how to staff and fund these mandates. MentalSpace School essentially provides a plug-and-play infrastructure that makes a district fully compliant with the law while genuinely serving the students.
Okay, you brought up funding, which leads me to the absolute most obvious question. Having a dedicated team of licensed, diverse, highly trained clinicians on standby for same-day teletherapy inside a public school sounds incredibly expensive.
It sounds like it would be.
Yeah, how is this actually accessible to the average family in Georgia or to a district with a tight budget?
The accessibility is arguably the most innovative part of the entire model. They've structured it to integrate seamlessly into the existing insurance landscape. They accept almost all major commercial insurances, your standard providers like Blue Cross, Aetna, Cigna, United Healthcare, and so on.
Okay, but what about families without commercial insurance?
That's the real game changer, how they handle state-funded healthcare.
Let me guess. Medicaid.
Yes. For students who are on Medicaid, which includes Peach State, CareSource, and AmeriGroup, there are zero out-of-pocket costs for the family.
$0. Wait, literally nothing.
$0.
That is massive. You are taking the absolute gold standard of clinical care, the DBT skills, the immediate triage, and completely removing the financial barrier to entry for the most vulnerable populations.
Completely. You don't have to choose between paying the electric bill and getting your teenager a psychiatric assessment.
Yeah.
And from the school's perspective, it drastically reduces the administrative headache of trying to manage community referrals that rarely ever pan out.
So the infrastructure is there, the privacy is secure, the financial barriers are removed. Let's look at the actual data. What happens when you combine these clinical tools with this rapid school-based access? Do we have hard numbers on the real-world outcomes of this model?
We do, and the numbers are incredibly compelling. Schools utilizing MentalSpace report an 89% improvement in attendance for the students engaged in the treatment.
Wow, 89%.
Yeah, and families report an 85% satisfaction rate with the care provided. Well, the statistic that is most relevant to our conversation today is a 92% reduction in anxiety among treated students.
A 92% reduction in anxiety. I mean, I know we shouldn't get overly amazed by single statistics, but that is a staggering number. However, if we think back to the mechanics we discussed, it actually makes perfect clinical sense.
How do you see it connecting?
Well, if the root cause of the self-injury, I mean, the whole reason the adolescent is using that dangerous release valve in the first place, is an inability to process overwhelming anxiety and emotional pressure.
Right.
Then dropping their baseline anxiety by 92% is essentially diffusing the bomb before the timer even runs out.
You've hit the nail on the head. You are lowering the baseline temperature of the boiler. When the anxiety drops, the unbearable pressure drops.
It's all connected.
And simultaneously, through the therapy, you are installing those DBT skills, like the TIPP techniques we discussed, as a safe functional release valve for whatever pressure remains. When you treat the underlying emotional pressure, the desperate need for the maladaptive coping mechanism naturally disappears.
It's a complete shift from reactive punishment to proactive healing. If you are an educator, a principal, or a parent listening to this and wondering how to implement this kind of ecosystem in your own district, checking out MentalSpace School's website is a great place to start understanding how the logistics work on the ground.
Yes, their website is mentalspaceschool.com, or you can email them at mentalspaceschool@hastherapy.com.
Awesome. But before we wrap up today's deep dive, we need to pause and make something very, very clear. We have spent the last 15 minutes or so talking about NSSI as a coping strategy and how to manage and replace it over the long term. But an emergency is an emergency.
Absolutely. This is non-negotiable. While NSSI is primarily about coping with pain, the physical risk is real, and the potential for accidental severe harm or an escalation to suicidal ideation is always present.
It's never something to take lightly.
Never. If you are listening to this right now and a teenager is in immediate life-threatening danger or is experiencing active suicidality, you must take immediate action. You call or text 988. That is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It is available 24/7. Long-term therapy is for tomorrow. Immediate physical danger requires an immediate emergency response today.
988. Seriously, keep that number saved in your phone just like you would 911.
It saves lives.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We have covered a lot of ground today. We started with the terrifying, gut-wrenching discovery of a teenager self-injuring, and hopefully we have helped shift the perspective from sheer panic to mechanical understanding.
Getting away from that initial biological fear.
Exactly. We've redefined NSSI not as a desire to end life, but as a desperate biological cry for a way to manage unbearable emotional pain. We've looked at how specialized skill building, like the mammalian dive reflex used in DBT, provides a new, safe release valve.
The ice water trick.
Yeah, the ice water trick. And finally, we've seen how systemic, school-integrated solutions are bridging the gap, bringing same-day $0 Medicaid access to these life-saving tools right into the nurse's office, treating the anxiety before the pressure boils over.
It represents a fundamental shift in how we view adolescent mental health.
Mm.
But as we close, there's a broader underlying context here that I think is really worth considering.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we've learned today that NSSI happens because adolescents lack the internal tools to process intense emotional pain. It makes you wonder, in a modern world that is increasingly fast-paced, digital, and hyper-connected, a world where discomfort is often instantly scrolled away or immediately smoothed over by technology, are the everyday environments our children grow up in actively suppressing the development of these essential distress tolerance skills before they even reach adolescence?
Wow. That is a fascinating and heavy question to sit with. Are we basically building boilers with no valves right from the very start, simply because modern life is so frictionless?
It's definitely something to think about.
It's something for all of us to observe and think about in our own homes as we navigate this incredibly complex landscape. That is all for today's deep dive. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and we will see you next time.